Good afternoon. I'm going to continue my series on Gukesh at the Budapest Olympiad. In the second round, Gukesh came up against the Hungarian Grandmaster Adam Kozak. Gukesh has white, Kozak has black. Let's see what happens. D4, yeah, very standard. Knight F6, again very standard. The Indian game, the most flexible reply to D4. You can always play D5 afterwards. You can always play E6, go for some kind of a Nimtsevich or Nimtso Indian or something similar. You can go for a straightforward Queen's Gambit with D5. You have a great deal of flexibility here. Pawn to C4, taking control of the centre. Bishop to E6, the East Indian defence releases the bishop. Gukesh develops his knight, and Kozak says check. The Bogo Indian defence, named after Yefim Bogolyubov, former World Championship finalist, played against Alyaki. The idea is that you make it so that the knight and bishop aren't very comfortable here. So the knight comes out, and C5, D5 to attack the C pawn. Check, threatening the knight. And now the black knight is a bit awkwardly placed. So he plays to defend the pawn and defend the pawn. So that now both of these pawns are defended. Admittedly, the knight was defending this pawn before, and this knight which was attacking it is pinned, but that's the idea. The knight's no longer pinned. And the question is put to the bishop. And yes, black is willing to take. His idea being that he will play to E4 and gain back this bishop. And he does indeed play to E4, and the rook defends. The knight comes to E7 to make a stronger defence of the D5 square, and to look at possibly manoeuvring over to the king side. The bishop comes to D3. Pawn comes to B6 so that the bishop can develop in that direction, and the queen doubles up so that there is a threat to take the pawn and then take the pawn. The bishop comes to B7. Good place to develop the bishop, and then also puts an end to this possible move. It's a possible win of a pawn. White castles as well, and has completed his development. Black plays to H6. He really doesn't want to see a swap off and then the knight come in here. So the bishop retreats, so that black no longer has the possibility of gaining taking away the two bishops from Gukesh. Pawn comes to A5, sensible enough expansion on the queen side, and the pawn comes to B3 to allow the bishop to use the B2 square. And a good deal of the next part of the game is about, can one of the players take one of the pawns in the centre. So the knight comes to G6 to solidify the centre, and possibly to make it possible to push this pawn once the rook has come to E8. Bishop comes to B2, very good development for the bishop, and also puts pressure on the F5 square, E5 square. Black plays to F5, so there's no longer any thoughts of taking here and winning a pawn. Black comes to A4. It gives white. Gukesh comes to A4. It gives black less place on the less room on the queen side, and also opens up an interesting diagonal on a3 for the bishop. Rook comes to f7. He might move the queen and double the rooks on the f file. He might play the rook to d7. It's flexible. There's a great deal of manoeuvring and rearranging of pieces in this game. But we'll see. This knight move wasn't necessarily to rearrange the position of the knight, but to chase away that knight. Now that it can no longer take on d2. It's a good opportunity to chase it away and gain some space in the middle. Now he's going to be looking to find a way to play e4. Oh, sorry. So, bishop is played to e2. This will allow the knight to come here, and then possibly here, and then the bishop to come back here, and the rooks to double up on here, and then e4 is looking possible. So the queen starts by taking a little bit more control over the e file. The knight comes to d3, possibly looking at f4, but also f2 is a square which controls the important e5 square. At the moment, black has bishop, pawn, pawn, knight, and rook defending, queen defending e5. This pawn is in the way of that defense, but something can be done about that. And white has pawn, putting pressure on e5. So obviously not enough yet. So knight comes to d7. Maybe it may be possible to push to f5, f4, and swap off there and weaken white's grip on the e4 square. The rook comes to e1. Yeah, can't be a bad idea. And the knight comes to e7. Maybe he's thinking of coming here and pushing this pawn. The bishop retreats so that he's a step nearer to playing e4. The knight comes to c6 to put some pressure on this pawn. Bishop uses the a3 file. Stop doubling up on using the f8 square. The knight comes to f6. So that has been a bit of shuffling back and forwards to no real purpose by black. It looks a fairly closed and even position, but you don't have time to shuffle back and forwards to no purpose, especially when your opponent has a purposeful plan. And he has a purposeful plan to play the knight to f2, play the bishop to d3, maybe take this pawn, play the pawn to e5, and e4, and then create a central pawn storm. The rook comes to c1. Now he introduces tactical ideas against this knight on c6. Obviously you don't want to take the pawn and then take with the queen because you lose the queen, but it is now under attack. Rook comes to d7. Yeah, it's a good square. The knight comes to f4, not f2, attacking the d6 square. It might be possible at some point in time to play a sacrifice here and then play pawn takes e5, or play a sacrifice here. Queen defends the pawn. Defended it before, but now it allows the rook to come here, and the rooks can possibly double up to support e5 break. So the moving to d7 was also making a square for the queen, so that the doubling on either the d file or the e file can follow for black. So, okay, a pawn break is finally made, and the rook retreats instead of doubling, because there's some risk taking this pawn, and then at some point in time the knight is exposed to an attack. and the bishop doubles up on the knight, so he's transferred his pieces, which were aiming for e4, to the c6 weakness. This is a hole because all the pawns have gone onto black squares, so he tries to exploit that. And now the queen moves out the way, so there's a rook, so that maybe there is some opportunity to do an exchange here. Queen comes to f6, a useful square, looking to double the rooks on the c file, so that because if he takes the pawn to open the attack on the knight, then the rook then defends the pawn, so he needs to have more attackers. The pawn comes to g5, a reasonable expansion, but if you look, it does create weaknesses around black's king. Will Gukesh be able to exploit these weaknesses? Knight comes to d3, looking at the e5 square, but also going back to the plan of playing to f2 and then making the e4 break, if he can make things solid enough first. The knights double up each other, but really, what is that knight doing on b8? Nothing at the minute. It is possible for black to transfer one knight to f7 and then the other knight to c6. That's one way to make them more active, but at the minute, even though it's defending the knight, it's really a dead knight on b8. So, doubles up the rooks on the c file in case it becomes open. Queen goes to g7 and the queen goes to e1. Again, no pieces have been taken. 32 moves, everything's on the board. It's a bit like one of those 15 puzzles where you have to slide the numbers to get them. One square open, you have to slide the numbers to get them all the numbers in the right place. Here, both players are sliding around their numbers trying to get their pieces into the right place. King goes to h8. I don't really like that. I don't like putting the king and the queen on the same diagonal. So he takes the opportunity to play knight to e5. But doesn't this win a pawn? Not really. He takes the knight. It's taken back with the pawn, but he daren't play queen takes pawn because bishop comes here. But actually, bishop can come here anyway, and then maybe he can find a way to move this pawn, which stops this pawn from moving. When this pawn gets the opportunity to move, it will be either check or a pin on the queen. So the pawn comes to c6. The bishop attacks the f pawn straight away, so that he's threatening to play bishop takes, bishop to b2, bishop takes pawn, and when pawn takes bishop, pawn to e6, pinning the queen to the king. But the pawn is taken on c5 first, no problems, takes it with the rook. The rook is threatened and he wins the pawn on a5. Dare black take the e5 pawn? He dares. Is it wise? I don't think so. Bishop comes out of the way. At the minute, he's not got any tricks with the bishop on b2 because b2 is an undefended square. He can't put the bishop there. The queen would just take it. So rook comes to 8, saying he's willing to have a swap. The rook comes to c2 so that he can support the bishop on b2. Knight comes to g6. Bishop to b2 is still not going to give anything because he just puts the pawn in the way. But he does it anyway. The pawn comes in the way. Now, he's got the task of finding a way to attack this pawn one more time. So the rook swapped off. Takes with the bishop to keep the rook more central. That makes sense. Pushes the passed pawn he's now created. King comes to h7. Does this mean this is no longer dangerous? There's still a danger to the queen. Pushes the pawn again. Bishop comes to... rook comes to b8. Attacking this pawn. and it pushes, defended by the queen. Which, yeah, opens up the possibility of playing here and maybe at some point in time getting a check on the 7th rank. The rook comes to a7 and the rook comes to c5. Yeah, just creating threats. Queen comes to e7. Yeah, now he's just shuffling his queen about. It's difficult for him to find a way to make progress. So the queen comes to c3, so that there are no threats on the long diagonal of possible mates, if he can distract the pieces which are stopping it enough. Rook comes to d8, and the queen retreats and attacks the f pawn. Pawn comes to e4, and it's taken, and it's taken. And now he wants to break down this structure. He can't take, because if he takes, the rook will come here and be threatening mates. So the queen comes to c7, and the pawn takes. If he takes with the bishop, the rook takes. He goes down a bishop. So he moves the rook to cover this line and to just generally lend some support to the weakened king side. Bishop comes to b6 to defend the pawn so that the rook is free, the queen is free. This queen stopping this passed pawn from coming any further forward and becoming a new queen. We call that a blockader. A queen is a particularly poor blockader because if it gets attacked by a weaker piece, it has to move. So the knight comes to e7 to defend the d5 pawn. But Gukesh takes the d5 pawn anyway. If he takes the rook, then queen takes pawn check, and he's in the crossfire of these two bishops, of the bishop and queen, and this bishop will soon enough contribute, and it would lead to a quick mate. So he defends his king a little bit more by moving to f7, but the queen says check anyway. King comes to g8, and the queen comes to d4. He's threatening mate here, he's threatening check here. Yeah, if he defends the check on the 8th rank with a rook here, then queen comes here, and the king is quickly run out of places to go to. So yeah, a fantastic maneuver in which suddenly, it seems almost suddenly, the tactic came out of it. But the tactic was based on the weakness in Black's kingside after he'd moved these pawns. And from move White's move 33, where there had been no captures, it's only 21 moves later, the board is almost empty and mate is unstoppable. Fantastic game by Gukesh. A really nice little attack. Yeah, don't forget to like, subscribe, share and comment on my videos. Thanks. Bye.